I think what I'm talking about is how correct economic theory can lead to incorrect policy proposals. And I'm going to start out with economic theory. I assume some of you are econ students and have heard this before, but you'll have to put up with hearing it again. And then go on to the problem in using this theory to actually advocate policy. And we start with the basic problem that all societies face, and that's a coordination problem. That in order to achieve much of anything, you need to get millions of people to cooperate. The sort of the classical version of this called iPencil, which is a story pointing out how many people it takes to make a pencil, because no one alive knows how to make a pencil. Why is that? Well, to make a pencil, you need wood. To have wood, you need to cut down trees. To cut down trees, you need chainsaws. To have chainsaws, you need steel and gasoline and a whole bunch of other things. To have steel, you need steel mills, which require follow the list down, and it's literally true that nobody knows how to make a pencil, that it depends on somehow coordinating the activities of a very large number of people. And this is true for most things we do. You can imagine a very lucky Robinson Crusoe surviving by himself, but he's going to survive at a pretty low standard of living by our standards. And it's pretty clear that if you did not have ways of coordinating the behavior of very large numbers of people, you could not support a world population anywhere close to the population we actually support. And there are basically two classes of solution to the coordination problem. There is the obvious solution, which is the one that doesn't work, and there is the non-obvious one that does. And the obvious solution is central command and control, right? The obvious solution is that there's some authority who says, you cut down the tree. In order for you to do that, you mine some iron ore, and you mine some coal, and you put them together in the following fashion, and so forth. And that form of coordination works for very small groups. If you think about a football team, or maybe even a club at a college. But it doesn't scale very well. That if you imagine trying to use that mechanism, not for 6 people, but for 100 million people, you're funneling a whole lot of information through a tiny gap through the mind of one person or a committee of people. You're losing a lot of the information on the way up and on the way down as you funnel information up and commands down, and the result is Stalinist Russia. That's an example of an attempt to run a society on that basis. It probably survived only because a lot of it was actually running through the black market on a different basis, and it worked very poorly. The alternative method, and the one that does work, is some decentralized system where you somehow divide up the problem so that each person makes his own decisions, and yet it's in the interest of each person to make about the right decisions to get the coordination that makes everybody better off. And the sort of standard way of doing that is something along the lines of private property and trade. I say along the lines because you can imagine a range of different legal systems that have this basic characteristic. And the problem with that is that in order for it to work, you have to somehow set up the system or set up the rules of the game or the laws of the society in such a way that the decision it's in my interest to make in terms of my interest is about the decision I ought to make in terms of everybody's interests. So if we could somehow structure the world so that when I do anything, when I make any choice, I bear all the costs and receive all the benefits, then the result will be that if total benefits are larger than total cost, it pays me to do it. And I should do it because for the world as a whole, total benefits are larger than total costs. If total benefits are less than total costs, I don't do it and shouldn't do it. And you then have a perfectly functioning decentralized system. And the problem is that we can't manage that we can't do a perfect job of arranging our rules in such a way that people bear all the costs of their actions or receive all the benefits of their actions. Strictly speaking, you don't have to. It's enough that we get the difference between costs and benefits right. We don't have to get the actual numbers right. So if we could somehow structure it so that I always bore 90% of the costs and receive 90% of the benefits. If 90% of benefits minus cost is positive, then benefits minus cost is positive. That's fairly straightforward arithmetic. So that would do it as well. But even doing that is pretty hard. Right? And the standard way this problem is put in economics class is in terms of what are called externalities. So we imagine that I'm making the steel that's going to be used for those chainsaws that are cut down the tree to make the pencil. And in order to make the steel, I've got to hire workers. Well, that's all right. I've got to pay the workers enough so they'd rather work for me than do anything else they could do, so I'm not imposing a net cost there. When I make the steel, I sell it to people, and they're going to have to pay. They're not going to pay me any more than it's worth to them. So if the amount I can sell it for is larger than the amount it costs me to make it, both it's profitable to me and it's a net benefit to the world. But there's a problem. And the problem is that I don't have to pay for the effect on the air downwind of the sulfur dioxide and other unpleasant things I'm putting into the air. So you can easily enough imagine a case where the costs I'm paying are $10 billion, and the value of what I'm producing is $11 million, so it looks like a good deal, but the costs of the air pollution are $2 million, make it pounds if you prefer. I'm used to doing my lectures in dollars. You can convert inside your heads if you like. It's 1.6 something at the moment. So the result is that even though it's a $1 million profit for me, it's a $2 million loss for us. And in that case, I'll make the wrong decision. I'll produce steel even though I shouldn't. And similarly, you can imagine less extreme cases where I ought to produce steel, but I ought to have a high smokestack to reduce the effect of the pollution. The smokestack saves people downwind $100,000. It costs me $50,000, but it benefits me zero, so I don't build it. Same problem. So in a world where you'll have external costs that people don't have to pay, they will be making the wrong decisions in terms of private decisions being in the general net benefit. That's a problem. It's a problem economists have been aware of for a long time, of course. And roughly speaking, there are three different approaches to solving it. The first one corresponds to the first way of solving the coordination problem. That is to have some authority who says, you mayn't build a steel mill there because we've calculated there's a net $1 million loss allowing for the air pollution. You can build a steel mill there, but we'll require you to have 100-foot tall smokestack because we've calculated that's the right way of doing it, and so forth and so on. And if you had an omniscient and benevolent regulator, that method would work. But if you try to think through first how much you have to know in order to actually make all of those decisions, you're back with something very much like the attempt to solve the coordination problem by central authority. In addition to which, not only do we have a shortage of omniscient regulators, we have a shortage of benevolent regulators. And if you have the ability to give orders to steel companies, it's going to be very tempting to tell a steel company that contributed to the re-election campaign of the person who put you in office as a regulator that he's free to do whatever he likes. His competitors, on the other hand, have all sorts of restrictions on them. Similarly, even if there's no corruption in that form, it might be tempting to say, well, this regulator slipped me 10,000 pounds quietly, so I'll give them permission to do what they want. That one didn't. And in practice, at least by the US experience, and I suspect the British experience, what's very common is the legal version of this, which is that the regulator does favors for the regulated firm while he's in office and gets a nice high-paid job with the regulated industry when he's out of office. So all of these suggest that the regulatory solution in practice has serious problems. There's another solution, which is the one that economists have generally tended to favor for quite a while, and it's usually associated with a British economist. I'm not sure if he was at Oxford or not, by the name of Pigou. And Pigou's argument was a very simple and elegant argument. He says, look, we've already got this decentralized mechanism. Let's just make it work. So if the sulfur dioxide I'm putting into the air is imposing a cost of 2 million pounds a year downwind, charge me 2 million pounds a year for it. Say I'm free to do all the pollution I like at a price. And if the person who is imposing the externality has to pay a so-called Pigouvian tax, an effluent fee in the example of air pollution, which actually is an accurate measure of the damage done by his externality, then he'll make the right decision because he will now include in his costs that extra 2 million pounds as well as the cost of his iron ore and his labor and so forth. And so now, if it's in his interest to do it, it's in our interest to do it. And that's Pigou's basic solution. Another British economist by the name of Ronald Coase pointed out several decades later that Pigou's argument, which everybody in the profession by that time had accepted, was wrong. That Pigou was making a fundamental logical mistake, several of them actually, but this is only discuss one, that being that he was regarding the cost of my air pollution on your breathing as something due to me. But really it's due to both of us. There would be no problem if I wasn't putting out the sulfur dioxide, and there would be no problem if you weren't living downwind from the sulfur dioxide. And Coase says that means we should really think of it not as an external cost produced by me, but as a cost jointly produced by both of our decisions. And you can imagine cases, perhaps the air pollution downwind isn't a good one, but you can imagine cases where the lowest cost way of solving the problem is not to stop the, quote, polluter from polluting, but to stop the, quote, victim from being a victim. So if you imagine that we're talking not about air pollution, but about noise pollution, and there's an airport, and planes are landing over the airport, and there are some nice fields underneath the airport with cows grazing in it that occasionally are irritated by the noise, and someone decides to put a housing development there. And having put a housing development there, he then sues the airlines on the grounds that their noise is imposing an external cost on the people living in his houses, and therefore they've got to stop making noise or come in very high or modify their airplane. It's quite likely in that case that the lower cost avoider would actually be not the airlines but the housing developer. He should have left the cows there and built his housing development somewhere else. That was part of Coase's argument. Another part, and it's worth reading Coase's article, The Problem of Social Cost, which is probably the most cited single article in economic analysis of law. But another point he made was that if people can transact with each other, you don't need a externality, a Pigouvian tax. All you need are well-defined property rights. Because if it's clear whether I do or don't have the right to put out sulfur dioxide from my steel mill, if I do have the right, and I could prevent it by spending 10,000 pounds on a high chimney, and it's doing 100,000 pounds worth of damage downwind, the people downwind will offer to buy me my chimney and give me a little extra money to throw in. I'm better off, they're better off, it's solved. Turn it around, if I don't have the right to do it, if the people downwind have the right to enjoin me from polluting because it's a violation of their property rights, but if the damage to them is small and the advantage of having a steel mill there is large, I will buy from them sort of an easement, I will buy from them their consent to have me put out the pollution, and again we get the right result. So that gives what's sometimes called the Coase theorem, which is that in a world of zero transaction costs, you will get the economically efficient outcome whoever has the initial rights. Now, Coase, of course, realized that we don't live in a world of zero transaction costs, that to apply that particular approach to solving the problems of air pollution in Los Angeles requires all of the people who breathe in Los Angeles to bargain with all the people who drive in Los Angeles, mostly the same people, of course, to bargain to an appropriate restriction on driving to not put out too much air pollution and so forth. That's not going to happen. So the sort of bottom line of that is that Pigou's argument is right for those cases where A, we know which side is the lower cost avoider, and B, where transaction costs are high enough so they're not going to be able to bargain for the right solution, but it's wrong in some other cases. Interesting point for law and econ people, but for purposes of the argument I'm going to be making tonight, I'm perfectly willing to accept Pigou, because I'm considering cases such as global warming, where the Coasean solution clearly is not an option. We aren't going to get 8 billion people bargaining with each other, and where maybe it's not so clear the next part, but at least not living in the world, which is presumably the very most effective way of avoiding problems of global warming, is not a practical option, at least until we have much cheaper space flight than we get. All right. So the basic theory of the argument is right. And then let's think of a few examples in the world that now exists, where people argue there is a negative externality. I should say you can have positive externalities too, where you reverse the argument and now you want a subsidy instead of a tax on Pigouvian grounds. That's where I'm producing a benefit I'm not collecting instead of a cause. So let's look at a few of the real-world examples. And I want to start with one which was actually the subject of my first piece of published economics, and that's the population issue. Because this would have been about 1971 or so, about 40 years ago. And it was very widely held then that one of the great problems of the world was overpopulation, that the reason why poor countries were poor was there were too many people in them, and that something had to be done about it. And obviously something you could do about it, I'm not sure if any country did, would be to have a tax on having children. But China did try the regulatory approach, which was the one-child rule, to make a rule with some exceptions that each couple could only have one child in order to hold down their population. I should say there have been earlier cases where countries reached the opposite conclusion. We thought there was a positive externality from having a child, that they were worried about not enough people. And this is a worry which is reappearing, as you probably know, in Europe at present for various reasons, and therefore had bounties, and that has happened not uncommonly to have a child with bounty. So in both of these cases, you're having in one case the regulatory solution, in one case the Pigouvian solution to a supposed problem. Another case, which is pretty familiar, is air pollution. And there, I don't know what the rules are here, but at least in the US, there's an Environmental Protection Agency which makes various rules which amount to the equivalent of my high smokestack thing. And there has been a good deal of criticism that which rules they make. One fairly well-known example is that in regulating sulfur dioxide, they made a rule which amounted to saying if a power plant was producing out sulfur dioxide, they had to have equipment that removed a certain percentage of sulfur from the stuff coming out, 80% or 90%. That sounds great until you realize that the alternative way of keeping down sulfur is to use low sulfur coal. Well, if you say whatever coal you use, you've got to remove 90% of the sulfur dioxide coming out, there is no longer any advantage to using low sulfur coal. Oddly enough, senators from states that mined high sulfur coal preferred the rule the EPA made to the rule they might have made, which would be a limit on the sulfur or Pigouvian tax on the sulfur. So there were problems of that sort. Finally, let me get to what's currently the big one, which I'll be talking more about in a little while, and that's global warming. And in the case of global warming, I don't know the details of the European situation, but in general, in terms of arguments in the US, you have had various arguments for regulatory restrictions. You have had a proposal made by quite a lot of economists for a carbon tax, in which you have a Pigouvian tax proportion to the amount of carbon you're turning into carbon dioxide and putting into the air. And you have something very much like a carbon tax with a different form, which is what's called cap and trade. Cap and trade is really a different mechanism for the same thing. What cap and trade says, roughly speaking, is we figure out how much carbon dioxide everybody produced last year. We decide we want to cut output by 10%. Everyone is allowed to produce 90% as much this year as last year. But the right to produce carbon dioxide is tradable. And there are various tradable carbon permits, as you probably know, exist among some countries at present. So I'm giving a much simpler version than the actual legislation, which passed the House but not the Senate in the US. But the simple version would be everyone has the right to put out 90% as much, and the right to put out a certain amount of carbon dioxide is a marketable thing, like a piece of paper. So if it turns out that my company can cut down to 80% quite easily, great, the excess 520 tons of carbon dioxide we're not producing, we can sell the right to another company where they find it very hard to cut below 95%, say. And if you think about the economics of that, you will see that in most respects it looks just like a carbon tax. Because if the market price for those permits ends up as, say, $1,000 a ton, then everybody who produces carbon dioxide has a $1,000 a ton incentive not to produce it. If I'm below my limit, I'd like to get even lower because then I can sell the permits for $1,000 a ton. If I'm above my limit, then each ton I produce requires me to buy permits at $1,000 a ton. So either side, from an incentive standpoint in both cases, each ton I put out costs me $1,000, just like a carbon tax. The only difference is that with a carbon tax, the revenue goes to the government. And with a cap and trade, the revenue goes to the companies in proportion to how much carbon dioxide they were putting out last year. And from the standpoint of a government that would like money, that's an advantage for a carbon tax. But from the standpoint of a government that would like to pass such a law, it might be an advantage to cap and trade because you've just bribed the obvious opponents of the law not to oppose it, since if you work out the economics, cap and trade might actually raise the profits of the power companies instead of lowering them. If any of you are econ students, I'll leave that as an exercise to the reader, but according to how the numbers turn out, since you are in effect imposing an increase in marginal cost, which raises the price you can sell your product at the same time you're imposing a cost, it may well be that total revenues minus total costs go up rather than down. But basically, seen at a distance, they're really the same system. Now, what's wrong with all of this? And the argument I'm going to make is that what's wrong with this, at least in the first and third case, not so sure about air pollution, but in the case of both population and global warming, is that in each case, the externalities are of both sides. Having an extra kid both produces costs and benefits for other people. Warming the planet produces both costs and benefits for other people. The size of both costs and benefits is very uncertain because these depend on events into the distant future. And as somebody said long ago, it's really hard to make predictions, especially about the future. The result is that not only do we not know the size of the externality, in those two cases we don't even know the sign of the externality. That I will claim that one cannot convincingly show that global warming on the currently projected level, I'll come back to that in a minute, makes us on net worse off. It will certainly make some people worse off. It will certainly make some people better off. And we don't know what the sum is. Similarly, as I argued in my first piece of economics research about 40 years ago, we do not know whether having an extra child on net makes the rest of the world better off or worse off. So let me start out with population. The standard argument for why population is a problem starts out with a mistake. It starts out with a negative externality. It's not a negative externality. And this is the very intuitive and plausible argument. It says, look, if there are more people, then there's less of all fixed resources per person. So if we have one more person, there's less land per person, less oil per person, and so on. And the problem with this argument is this is a cost, but it's not an external cost. Because a baby is not born clutching a deed to his per capita share of the world's resources in his little hands. Right? He's born owning nothing. In order for that baby to get land, somebody, he or his parents, has got to produce something of value, sell it and get money, use that money to buy the land from somebody else, paying that somebody else at least as much as the land is worth to him. So with regard to any resources that are private property, the effect of increasing the population is not a net negative effect outside of the family that's producing the extra child. It is, there are transfers. Owners of land are a little better off and renters of land are a little worse off if you bid up the price of land, but that's not a net cost. And similarly for other resources. So with regard to ordinary owned private property resources, this particular obvious externality is not an externality. Let me take a somewhat subtler one, where I'm also willing to argue it may not be an externality for a less obvious reason. And that's another point people make about the cost of having extra children, at least in the US, is we have a public school system. It costs about $10,000 a year to school a child in the US, roughly. Therefore, if I have an extra child, that's one more child going to school, one more $10,000 that taxpayers, most of whom aren't me, are going to have to pay. And therefore, it's argued we are subsidizing children, or to put it differently, that children have a negative externality. Now, the problem with this is that while my child will indeed consume that amount of resources while he goes through school, he will then graduate from school, he will get a job, and he will pay taxes. And if you work it out on plausible assumptions, the net taxes that he will pay to pay for other children's education will roughly balance in present value terms the cost of his education. My article, Laissez-faire in Population, the Least Bad Solution, is available on my website if you want to read the gory details of the argument. And therefore, roughly speaking, this is a negative externality just about balanced by a positive externality. There are, however, real negative externalities. My child might mug your child. My child might produce air pollution that makes everybody else worse off. My child might go on welfare and not pay any taxes and collect money from other people, making them worse. All of those things are possible. But there are also a whole bunch of positive externalities associated with having children. That my children will pay taxes. Some of those taxes will go for things like the national debt, which are not costs that he creates. which are just sitting there, the more people the national debt is divided among, the less each one has to pay. Some of them will go to national defense. It's a little unclear. You might argue that richer countries' defense is more expensive because they're more attractive to attack. But at least to some extent, you can say, well, national defense is a fixed cost, more people dividing it, everybody else is better off. And there are lots of non-governmental, non-tax effects. My child might invent the cure for cancer. The more people are out there, the more people, cateris paribus, are going to be doing research into medicine. My child might write the novel you really like reading. If you think about a market like books, it doesn't cost any more to write a book and have 20,000 people than to have read it, than to write a book and have 10,000 people read it. So the larger the population, the more attractive it is to write books. The lower the royalties are going to be in equilibrium, the royalty rate, because if everybody is selling more books, then a smaller amount of money per book will be enough to make people willing to write books. Again, I'll leave it to the economists in the audience to work through the logic of this. But basically, where you have the kind of market where you've got a fixed cost, like the cost of writing a book, producing a benefit for an unlimited number of people, the more people there are to get the benefit, the larger, the better off we are. And you can think of quite a lot of other examples of ways in which having more people make us better off. Julian Simon, who was the one great holdout against the population hysteria of the 1960s, wrote a book called The Ultimate Resource. And his argument was the ultimate resource is human beings. And one of the things that made me sympathetic to that was that back when this was a popular argument, I did a calculation that no one else seemed to have done. And that was to calculate population density for the countries of the world. Because the implicit assumption, sort of in the rhetoric, was the reason India and China are poor is they have so many people. And the reason, presumably, that England and Germany and Belgium are rich is they don't have so many people. Well, if you do the arithmetic at the time, it turned out that of the 5 most densely populated countries in the world, 2 of them were, 2 or 3, I think Singapore was independent. So I guess 3 of them were very successful developing countries. And 2 of them were rich developed countries. Belgium and the Netherlands were. Belgium, the Netherlands, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore were the 5 most densely populated countries. Not a single one of them fit the pattern of desperately poor third world country. There's one that does now. After Pakistan split, Bangladesh gave us our first example of a country that was very poor and very, very highly populated. But at the time I did the calculation, that was still getting averaged in with the population of the rest of Pakistan, which isn't nearly as high. So that made me a little skeptical. Now, population density is a very crude measure. It's true. I should say at that time, the most densely populated part of the world was not, I didn't count because it wasn't a country, that was Hong Kong. It was a crown colony. Hong Kong had about 10 times the population density of Singapore. Singapore was the most densely populated country in the world. Hong Kong, over about the next 20 or 30 years, got a per capita income that went above that of England, or of the UK, actually. I don't know if they were averaging out Scotland and Wales in that one as well. So that was sort of a fairly striking counterexample. But in any case, my conclusion what I tried to do in my article, in this pamphlet I was writing, was simply to add up the externalities from having a child. And I concluded that I could not sign the sum. That the values, positive and negative, were sufficiently uncertain, so one couldn't tell whether it on net made other people better or worse off. Almost certainly my opinion then and now is that it depends on the kid. That my children, of course, make the world much better off. Because by pure good luck, I produce the world's most wonderful children. Now, you might think that producing the world's most wonderful children would really be scary, because I'd be afraid that other parents would steal them from me. But luckily, all the other parents in the world are so prejudiced that they think they have the world's most wonderful children, so mine are safe. But generalizing the argument, it's probably true that adding some people to the world makes the world a worse place and some people a better place. But that there's no good argument I can see for the claim that on net, on average, extra people make us worse off. And I should say the predictions made by the people who took that claim for granted have been strikingly inconsistent with what actually happened over the 40 or 50 years after they made that prediction. As you may know, we were supposed to have world famines in the 1970s that would kill off, I remember the numbers, 20 or 30% of the population of the world, none of which happened. In fact, per capita consumption calorie consumption in the third world has been trending gradually up more or less from the end of World War II, which is when our data start, to the present. So in that sense, the predictions turned out to be wrong. All right, let me now go on to global warming, which is the current popular issue of this sort. And where I think, to give away my punchline, I reach the same conclusion, basically, that we don't know the net effects. Now, I am not an expert in climatology. I've read various bits of the arguments of both sides on this stuff. But for my purposes for the moment, I am willing to accept the IPCC projections as a plausible estimate of the global warming we can expect in the course of this century. And roughly, they call them projections, not predictions, because the predictions they were making in the earlier reports, although they were enough so that they thought we had to do something, were low enough so that they made alarmists uncomfortable, and so that's my theory of why they call them projections now instead. But in any case, something very roughly around 3 degrees centigrade and a foot or two of sea level rise for 100 years. Might be 5 degrees, it might be 2 degrees, but that's the kind of range. So I'm willing to assume that those projections are right. I'm also willing to argue that going beyond 100 years makes very little sense because we do not know enough about what human beings will be doing 100 years from now. In particular, I don't think it's particularly likely that fossil fuel will be an important input to energy generation 100 years from now. I'm not all that sure we're even going to be here 100 years from now. I wrote a book called Future Imperfect, which was an attempt to look at technological revolutions that might happen over the next few decades and what their implications would be. And I gave a talk at Google on the book. And I started out the talk by saying that it seemed to me that global warming was a pretty wimpy catastrophe. So the temperature of the world goes up 3 degrees, sea level goes up a foot or two. In 100 years, I got 3 different ways of killing off the human race faster than that. And I do. I can think of 3 different technological developments which could happen. And if they happened and went the wrong way, there will be no human beings of our species 100 years from now. One of the revolutions is artificial intelligence, in which case there might be people in a different sense, but there'll be people running on software, not people running on carbon. So, in any case, I think that really long-term, basing decisions today on very long-term effects is almost always a mistake. We don't know enough to know what direction the world's going. But I'm willing to go 100 years for the moment. And so then the question is, do we have any good reason to believe that changes on that scale would have large net negative effects? And there are 2 different ways you can look at this question. One of them is what I think of as the a priori argument, to say, is there a good reason, without looking at at the data, to expect a change of a few degrees in global climate to be a bad thing, or a very bad thing? And then if the answer is no, and I think the answer is going to be no, if you try to actually look at each of the effects, at sea level rise and various other negative effects, but also at positive effects, is there a good reason to think the sun is negative? I think the answer to that is also no. So let's start with the a priori argument. The current climate of the world was not designed for us. Presumably some religious believers would say it is, but if that's your view, then God can take care of global warming too, so that's not an issue. But for those of us who accept sort of more or less the conventional Darwinian, geological, etc. explanation of how the universe came to be what it's like, there's no particular reason to think that the distribution of climates across the world at the moment is optimal for us. Nor were we designed for it. All right, you might say, well, what the world was like is sort of arbitrary accident, but then we evolved in that world, so it's optimal. But it isn't true. To begin with, over our species' history, the usual state of the world is half a mile of ice over this location. All right, we for the last 1,000,000+ years, we've been in what's called an ice age. An ice age is when the poles have ice on them. People usually use the term more narrowly. The ice age consists of repeated glaciations punctuated by interglacial periods. Glaciations, large parts of the world have ice on them, including London and Chicago, what are going to be London and Chicago. We're in an interglacial at the moment, and a good thing too. So we didn't evolve in this climate. And furthermore, we didn't evolve here. We evolved in Africa, where, as a general rule, it's warmer than it is in England and America and various other places. So there's no particular a priori reason to think either that the present climate is suited us or that we're suited here. And furthermore, the most obvious reason not to think it is that humans live and prosper across a wide range of climates. If you think about the range of places where human beings grow food, live, have babies, do all the things human beings do, it covers a whole lot more than 3 degrees centigrade range. There is, however, one good a priori argument against change in either direction, warming or cooling. And that is that we are currently optimized, we not by evolution, by our own actions, against the current environment. So if you're a farmer, you are now growing those crops that grow well in the environment you're now in. If you have a house, and the house is in a very hot climate, you probably have air conditioning, at least if you're part of a rich country. If your house is in a cold climate, you have insulation, various kinds of heating. So in lots of ways, we have adapted our behavior to the way the environment currently is. Similarly, where we put houses depends, among other things, on where the shoreline is at the moment. And if the sea level rises and the shoreline moves in by a couple of 100 feet, there are going to be some houses that are underwater. At least the bottom of them is going to be underwater. That's inconvenient. So there is a real cost to change in either direction, which is, from an economist standpoint, we've made sunk costs, we've built buildings, we've learned how to cultivate certain crops and so forth. And as the change occurs, some of that no longer is suited to the new environment, and therefore we've got to, in effect, write it off as a lost cost. That's a real cost. That would be a serious cost if we were talking about 3 degrees next year. But we're talking about 3 degrees over a century. Talking about a third of a degree a decade, roughly. A 30th of a degree a year. Over 100 years, farmers are going to change their crops multiple times with or without global warming, because people will develop new crop varieties, tastes will change, markets will change, someone will discover that they can grow the crop you were growing cheaper somewhere else, and you'll have to change and so forth. So if you think about the rate of change involved, the net cost of that change to the farmer is very, very close to zero, because he's going to be changing his anything. It's a little bit more than zero for houses. It's going to look bigger to you than to me, because I live in a new country. And as it happens, the house I live in San Jose is one of the few houses in our area of San Jose that's more than 100 years old. But most of the houses are like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years old. And what that suggests is that, less true obviously in Oxford than some other places, that most houses get replaced, most buildings get replaced within a period of as long as a century. Buildings fall down, styles change, law schools and business schools know that in order to prove they're really with it, they need the latest architecture to make their spiffy new building that they're spending $100 million on or whatever, and so forth. So that although the change in where literally tearing down a house and building a new one is expensive, but a good deal of that cost will happen anyway. And not much of it has to happen, because the cost of putting in air conditioning or improving your insulation or whatever is not that enormous. So my claim is that for the rates of change currently projected, the one real argument against change is a pretty weak argument. It suggests there are some costs to having change, but not huge costs. And of course, we don't know for sure that without global warming we wouldn't have change. It's not as if the world, I'm biased because I'm married to a geologist. Her reaction to seeing Trajan's Wall, I think it was, or maybe Hadrian's Wall, was how new it looked. I think her line is that to a geologist, the everlasting hills are a transient surface phenomenon. But if you think of it in terms of what we know about history, we know there was a global warm period. That's not evidence against global warming. I don't think we have evidence of temperature change in the past as rapid as the last century, when, by historical standards, they're going up pretty fast. But there are changes over time, and they're going to happen with or without human intervention. Some of them are going to happen. Don't know which ones. So in any case, my argument is that the a priori argument isn't very strong. And then you start trying to actually look at the costs and benefits. And that argument, again, becomes very weak. Because it's true that if you push up sea level by a foot, you're going to move shores in a little bit, and that's going to be a noticeable cost in a few parts of the world, such as Bangladesh, a fairly small cost in most of the world. On the other hand, we have to remember that the Dutch were farming land below high tide with the technology of several hundred years ago, right? They faced the problem, only they were on the aggressive. They were opening up new lands by pushing the ocean back. And I've actually seen an estimate someone tried to do of the costs associated with the combined cost of diking against sea level rise plus whatever flooding would result as well as it. And if you look at it as a percentage of world income, it's trivial. I don't remember the numbers anymore. Maybe it's 100%, that kind of scale. Furthermore, in terms of land loss, while it's true you're going to lose some land from sea level rising, you're going to gain a great deal more land from warming. Because one of the facts people tend to ignore is that at the moment, human habitation is limited by cold, not by heat. The equator is inhabited and the pole is not inhabited. And if you look at the globe, you see all of this useless land up in Alaska and northern Canada. You know, Canada is this country 3,000 miles wide and 3,000 miles broad and 50 miles deep. Beyond that, it's cold. I exaggerate a little bit, not by very much. And of course, across Eurasia, Siberia and Scandinavia and so forth, have a whole bunch of useless land. It's useless because it's too damn cold. Well, global temperatures go up, the contours move north, temperature contours. So now you might say, well, that just means there's some new land that's barely worth living in because it's so cold. Sure, but the land just south of that used to be barely worth living in, now it's pretty tolerable. And the land just south of that's pretty good. So if you think about the overall effect, it is to add very sizable areas of land to what human beings can use. And I did a very rough estimate. Somebody else may have done a more careful estimate since. But I concluded that the increase in land due to the moving of temperature contours was something like 100 times as large as the decrease due to sea level rise. There's a further point that, as far as I know, everybody agrees with, but almost nobody talks about in the global warming discussion. And that is that global warming is going to be larger in cold places and cold times than in warm places and warm times. And the reason for this is fairly straightforward physics. That the global warming is coming through the greenhouse effect of carbon dioxide. Water vapor is also a greenhouse gas. I think a stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. The warmer the climate, the more water vapor is in the air. The more water vapor is in the air, the less the effect of adding carbon dioxide. You can't stop more than 100% of the infrared coming up from the Earth's surface, which is what global warming is, what greenhouse effect is basically doing. So if where you are, 90% of it is already being stopped, putting in some extra carbon dioxide isn't going to increase the effect nearly as much as if only 5% is already being stopped. So as far as I know, this isn't a matter of dispute, although it's discussed very much. So that really means that my 3 degrees means something like 2 degrees at the equator and 4 degrees at the pole. I don't know what the real numbers are, but something that kind of effect. Well, as a general rule, warming is a bad thing in hot places and a good thing in cold places. And a bad thing in hot times of the year. The same thing works by seasons, by the way. You also get more global warming in winter than you will in summer for the same reason. So that means that the global warming is in some sense biased in our favor, biased in the direction of producing, in that respect, good effects rather than bad effects. So I think if you look at those arguments at least, they suggest pretty strongly that there will be large positive effects as well as negative effects. There's the negative effect I already mentioned. People will have to change the way they do things to some degree. On the other hand, there's another big positive effect, and that's a longer growing season. The warmer the climate is, the longer the part of the year during which you can grow crops, and in many parts of the world, that means the more food you get out. That one of the things people mostly don't quote from the IPCC projections is that for the first several decades, global warming increases food production rather than decreases it. It's only after that they can argue for various reasons that decreases it. So let me suggest then that we've got a general problem here, of which this is one example, and that is that where externalities exist with both positive and negative signs, and whether the effects are over a long enough period so that one cannot accurately predict their size, their scale, we cannot tell whether the net externality is positive. The result of this in practice is that if you start out believing that more people are a bad thing, or that global warming is a bad thing, you then do a calculation in which you make a generous estimate of the negative effects and a conservative estimate of the positive effects, and you miss some of the positive effects, so you're not really looking for them. And you say, aha, objective proof, global warming makes such and such an amount worse off. If, on the other hand, you like global warming, you do exactly the same process in reverse, and you end up concluding that global warming has good effects. And I've got a real-world example of this. There's an economist named Nordhaus, who, unlike me, is an expert in global warming. That's sort of been his specialty. And somewhere on the web, I came across a treatise of his. It's probably a few years old, so I don't know if it's his current view or not, in which he was analyzing global warming and the economic effects of global warming. And a rough summary of what he says is, if you only look at clearly predictable effects, you don't justify any serious efforts to stop global warming. You do not get large negative. I think you probably thought there were negative effects, but you do not get large negative effects. But he says we really ought to also allow for low probability catastrophes. We ought to say, what about things which probably won't happen, but if they did, would be really bad? And he made an attempt, and it's a very poor attempt because it's a very hard thing to do, but an attempt to estimate those, to basically ask various experts in different fields, how likely is it that something doing such and such an amount of damage would happen along the mechanisms you know about. And he then included those effects in his calculation. If you include those, now global warming is a serious problem. Does anybody see a problem with this procedure? Did he leave something out? He did not include any attempt to estimate low probability catastrophes that occur from stopping global warming. Or to put it differently, low probability, very desirable things from global warming. As I commented before, the natural state of this piece of the world in the last million years is half a mile of ice. All right? We know we're in interglacial. We do not know why interglacials stop and start. It is entirely possible, I'm not claiming it's likely, it's entirely possible, that the only reason the glaciers haven't started south again is we've been putting this carbon dioxide in the air and that warms things up a bit. Might not be true. I'm not claiming any confidence for this. But if you're going to talk about including low probability, large magnitude effect, you ought to do it in both directions. He didn't, because he knew what he was looking for. He knew that sort of his starting point was, well, people think global warming is bad, or there's good reason that, yeah, let's find some reasons. And naturally, he came up with what he expected to come up with. And he, I should say, is one of the less anti-global warming people in the field, so that I think he's argued that the Kyoto Accords cost several times what they're worth in terms of the net effect. But he thinks something ought to be done, something like a carbon tax, probably. So in any case, when I looked at his stuff, I thought that was a nice example of the pattern involved. And I'm not arguing this pattern applies only on one side. That I think if you look at people in this controversy, myself included, almost all of us have biases in one direction or another. That on the one hand, I think it's clear that many of the people who want carbon taxes and similar things also would want them if there were no global warming. That there are various people in the U.S. who think that really the right way to live is a European city, where people are close to their neighbors, and they aren't commuting out to the suburbs, and they all shop in the grocery store around the corner, and this is and they use mass transit instead of automobiles, and somehow this is a more civilized, desirable form of life. Some of them, I suppose, are people who happen to live more like that themselves. Well, if you believe that, then you say, well, what you call costs of preventing global warming, namely raising the price of gasoline, that's not a cost at all. That's a good thing. That'll nudge people into doing the kind of life that I know they ought to. That's a bias in one direction. There's a bias in the other direction. If global warming is a really serious problem and something has to be done about it, the something done about it is going to be done by governments. Well, I don't like governments. I don't trust governments. I don't want there to be good arguments for governments to do things. So I also am biased. I have an incentive to try to look for reasons why global warming isn't a problem. And each of us has to decide for himself, has to do the best he can to see through his biases and the biases of the people his arguments he's looking at in order to figure out what's really going on. So that's, I think, a further point that's worth making, because I think it is perfectly clear. I actually just noticed I had a message from a Google Plus exchange from an ex-girlfriend from a long time ago who, in response to my pointing out that a particular global warming argument was wrong, was saying, yes, but it's a good thing, isn't it, that we should stop cutting down rainforests and putting out air pollution and such, and so if global warming is an argument for doing that, fine. Well, I can understand her feeling that way, but that also comes out in practice, therefore don't criticize bad arguments that claim to prove global warming. The particular one I was criticizing, by the way, is that, as you probably know, there was a very serious storm on the east coast of the U.S. recently, which caused a huge amount of damage, and various people are asserting, look, this is due to global warming. Why is it due to global warming? Well, sea level is higher, and that results in more flooding. Well, it turns out that the previous record such thing was in the 1830s. And it's true that the high water of that was not quite as high water as this. But it's also true that that one hit at low tide and this one hit at high tide. And the difference between low tide and high tide is, I think, something like 8 or 9 times as large as the amount of sea level rise between the two times. So that if you, as far as I know, nobody claims that global warming makes hurricanes more likely to hit land at high tide than at low tide. So I was pointing out that this particular argument was a bad argument, and hence that was the context for that particular thing. All right, I've probably been talking long enough, especially if I got to give another talk this evening on something else. So why don't I stop talking for a bit and some of you start talking. I concluded long ago that one of the advantages of the question period is that when you're answering a question, you can be pretty sure that at least one person in the audience is interested in what you're talking about. Your turn.
We have about 30 minutes, so this week.
Yes.
Thanks a lot for the talk. I really like the externality argument as a basis for discussion of what we learn about global warming. Now, an objection to it is as follows, and you probably will disagree with one or more of my premises. Firstly, that global warming will not only harm humans, but other living beings that also are, we have reason to believe, are conscious. Secondly, that just like humans, or perhaps to somewhat of a smaller extent, those also have moral worth. And thirdly, that it's therefore our moral responsibility to prevent harm being done to those beings as well as to ourselves. And insofar as that, all those three premises are true, the externality argument only takes into account the effects on humans is serious underestimating the true negativeness of the externality.
It might well be a misestimate, but I'm not sure why you predict that it's an underestimate, because you're taking it for granted that the effects are negative.
Yeah, that's my first premise. So perhaps
I would have thought that it is true not only for human beings, indeed it's even true more for things other than human beings, that warmth is a bad thing in hot places and a good thing in cold places. Because other than human beings, other people don't have heating, air conditioning, and garments. So I would have... now, you may want to make a stronger statement. It's a statement which many people believe, which you'll find it harder to justify. And that is not in terms of the effect on individual organisms, but on species. And then you'll have to explain to me why the world is a better place if there are 2 species of deer, each of them with 1 million individuals, than if there were 1 species with 2 million. Why is there an extra value, as it were? Because this is, I think, a religious belief. It's a religious belief I have some sympathy for, but it's a religious belief I think it is hard to actually justify good arguments for.
Can I just
make a short
response? Yeah, so I agree with that point, but I mean, in the sense that humans can relocate with relative ease, and it's not a logistical nightmare, or not much as one to just transport people from Bangladesh to Canada or something along those lines, but it is to move individual animals, in that they don't automatically know they ought to move climates. Although perhaps you could argue they have some kind of built-in propensity to do so.
They don't have to have built-in propensity. All they got to do is propensity to live and to die. That is to say, if, again, we're talking about very slow changes. You're talking about a change of 1/3 degree of centigrade a decade. Well, what does that mean? It means that you've got a species with a range. At one end of the range, things start doing a little better, and the other end of the range a little bit worse than before. So populations do a little better here, a little bit worse here, and so forth and so on. So I'm not saying it is impossible that global warming will produce net negative effects for other species, merely that I don't see why you should assume it will. Yeah.
Aren't you ignoring the who aspect of the costs and benefits here? Because you could say that it's the rich world that gets most of the benefits, and they tend to live in a colder part of the world. And it's then going to be the poorer world, which is in the hotter part of the world, that the costs are imposed upon, and they're not the ones producing most of the carbon dioxide. So is that not a justification for some sort of compensation going between people?
That's an argument that is very popular, but it's very popular with the governments of the poor countries who are not poor people.
Yeah.
That is, I remember seeing some estimates of the effect on Bangladesh that were made by a government-funded institute, and which didn't emphasize the fact that the land loss they were talking about was over 250 years. And what they were arguing for was not loans, they made this quite explicit, but direct subsidies, and those subsidies were not to the population of Bangladesh 200 years from now, they were to the present government of Bangladesh. So, yeah, I don't know whether the net effect, whether you're right or not, because, again, over this long a period of time, you're going to have a lot of population shifts. The U.S. At 1900-ish was taking 1 million immigrants a year, about 1% of our then population a year. Transportation is a lot cheaper now than it was then, and even poor people are quite a lot richer now than they were then. So over 100 years, I could easily imagine shifts of 100, 200 million people from Southeast Asia to other places of one sort or another. And if I'm right that the total amount of land available for humans is going to increase noticeably, that's going to be a benefit for such people, because it means there'll be more places where they can go from. But there might be such a net effect. I don't know. But as far as I can see, actual proposals for transfers are almost always proposals for government-to-government transfers. And I do not believe that giving money to the government of India or of Bangladesh helps poor people.
Yeah. No, I agree. In practice, it's likely to be a scam, but there is a matter of principle you can argue about.
People should certainly be free to donate more of their income to what they see as deserving charities in poor parts of the world. But yeah. No, I think one reason why your argument doesn't come up very much is that in practical politics, almost everybody regards foreigners as not counting.
Yeah.
And the standard example of that is immigration arguments. And I think in the U.S. context, lots of people who honestly believe they're in favor of the poor are opposed to more immigration because they say, perhaps correctly, the immigrants will undercut the wages of the present American poor. May or may not be true. It's not clear. But suppose it's true. The present American poor are rich. That is to say, the immigrants are people who are largely, not all, but largely coming from places like Mexico and India and China, where the people who immigrate are much poorer than the present American poor. There can be no plausible doubt, I think, that the immigrants are going to be much better off if they can immigrate than if they can't. So you were saying in order to avoid pushing people down from 10 to 9, we're going to forbid a whole bunch of people to come up from 1 to 10. And that, I think, is morally indefensible, but clearly politically right, because you see what arguments get made. Right? Other people? Yeah.
So, do you think that there's potential that a lot of the technology that's being developed as a response to the perceived risk of global warming might end up having a massive net benefit? So I'm thinking of maybe solar power, particularly sort of advanced nuclear technology, that kind of thing.
It might, but if you didn't have worries about global warming, people are developing technology for other purposes. This is an argument which I know science fiction fans are fond of in a different context. They like. I think Heinlein claimed that the moon landing or something like that produced huge benefits. I'm very skeptical about it because you have technologies, they get particularly visible in high-profile efforts, but it's not as if power was free to start with. There's clearly an incentive to develop better solar power, and in fact, the cost of solar has been going down. I don't think that the cost of solar going down has a whole lot to do with worries about global warming. I think it's because solar is useful in some areas already, and it's clear to lots of people that if you could only get it down by about another factor of 2 or 3, it starts undercutting fossil fuel power, at which point it's a huge industry. So it's not impossible, but any mistake might have negative effects, but I don't think it's the proper way to gamble. Nobody? I persuaded everybody already. That's terrible. Yes?
Would you think that the utilitarian argument could be upheld if we were talking about something that didn't have such a slow rate of change, so that global warming is projected to have right now? Because then obviously we would have the problem. I personally subscribe to the non-aggression axiom, so I don't think that if an action of yours hurts somebody else, their damage can be sort of.
I understand.
You can use someone else's benefit as a counterweight to their damage, because in principle you're still.
I understand the argument, but the problem is that if you're going to take really seriously this kind of sort of natural rights approach, you have to think pretty hard about causation and where we get like rights we get, and how did I have the right to have the climate be what it now is, and so forth. And I think, in general, I have some intuitive sympathy for those arguments, but I think they're a whole lot harder to make if you really try to make them seriously against people who don't agree with them than they at first seem. But let me go back to your first question, because in Future Imperfect, my book about future technologies, one of the questions I discuss in the final chapter is, can technological progress make us worse off? And my answer is yes, it can. That the sort of first argument that it can't says, look, technological progress means we can do more of the things we want to do. That's clearly a benefit. The problem, as I see it, goes back to my discussion of the coordination problem at the beginning of the talk. And that is that we only have one solution to the coordination problem, basically, which is basically private property and trade. And whether that's workable depends on facts of reality. Depends on whether the actual effects of people's actions are either mostly short enough range so that I'm only damaging my own property, or at least easily enough measured and sort of judged so that we can use things like tort law and contract and such to allow for my effective methods. That's a contingent fact. Technological change might mean that most of the things I want to do have very large, widespread effects, in which case we go from one solution to zero solutions, and that's not an attractive outcome. So I actually offered global warming as an example of the kind of problem for which, in principle, there isn't a solution. And I said sort of in passing, I didn't think this particular one was very serious, but it could be. There's no logical reason why it couldn't be. And the reason we in practice have no solution is that the governmental solution breaks down in two different ways. First, we have no mechanism known of getting governments to act in the interest of people they rule. That's part of the reason I'm an anarchist. And second, even if we did, it's not only a public good externality problem at the individual level, it's true at the national level. There are lots of different countries. Why should China, which is finally, after thousands of years, it's getting this population of 2 billion people out of poverty, why should it sacrifice to save Bangladesh? And yet, not burning coal, which is its cheapest source of power at the moment, is a serious sacrifice which will slow down or stop the dramatic progress that China has been making in the last few decades. So even at the national level, you'd have the same problem. So I know that's why I'm putting it as going from one solution to zero solutions, because the top-down solution doesn't work at all well. So yes, no, it could be a problem. The problem, in a sense, with the argument you really believe in instead of the utilitarian argument, is how you discover, as it were, what is the status quo we're entitled to. Suppose, for example, that absent global warming, we'd have another glaciation. Does that mean that every time I pump carbon dioxide into the air, people who live in northern areas owe me money? And that they're being skinflints for not paying what they deserve? I'm not convinced it would be true even if we knew that was the case. And causation is a really complicated problem. I mean, for anybody who's curious enough, my book, Law's Order, which is an economic analysis of law book, is on the web, and I have a discussion of various cases where but-for causation works very badly. But-for causation is saying, but for my doing this, it wouldn't have happened. My favorite example of this is, I meet a friend in the street, we stop to chat for a minute, he walks on, a safe falls out of a high window and onto his head and crushes him. Did I kill him? Well, if I hadn't stopped him to talk, he would have been 15 feet farther along in the road, the safe would have missed him. But for causation, I killed him. And yet it doesn't feel to me like I killed him. Now, you can say, if you're a natural rights libertarian, but he chose to stop when I talked to him, I didn't force him to stop. But still, if you think about it as causation, there are lots of cases the global warming, I didn't force anybody to do anything, I just did things. I think it's harder than it at least seems to make these arguments in a satisfactory way. Other people? Yeah?
I have an argument about population control.
Sure.
So what if we were able, using genetic data, to predict with a good degree of certainty that someone was likely to produce children that would then go on to cause negative externalities?
Yeah.
I actually don't think that's a science fiction proposition. It's probably possible already in certain cases.
Yeah, probably not yet, but will be.
You could argue for certain diseases, people are going to produce negative externalities.
But they aren't really doing the negative externality. The negative externality occurs only because other people feel obliged to take care of them.
Yeah, okay. It's a cost, though. And,
but that's a little bit tricky, because are you really going to... Suppose we weren't talking about producing children. Suppose the question is, should I be allowed to destroy my life with drink? All right, it's on your word for a long time. And suppose you say you shouldn't be allowed to. I say, well, it's my own life. And you say, yeah, but if you destroy your life with drink, I'm going to feel obliged to feed you and take care of you. I say, Well, that's your problem. You say, no, you're imposing a negative externality. I'm going to be unhappy if I don't do that. So are you really willing to count that kind of externality? Because if you do, you've got a real problem. Because at least as a libertarian, you have a real problem.
Yeah.
Because the next thing they're going to say is, well, look, you say you've got a right to smoke marijuana. But I believe that smoking marijuana is terrible, so your smoking marijuana imposes psychological costs on me, so I can therefore forcibly stop you. Judge Bork, who was a prominent figure in the U.S., who there was a big controversy which resulted in not getting appointed to the Supreme Court. And I like to say that Bork is the only Supreme Court candidate I know of who has publicly explained why he was not a libertarian. Because he had quite a good law review article in which he made these arguments, and he made them seriously. That is, what he said is, if you believe that you're entitled to stop externalities by the law, that ought to include psychic externalities. That after all, the fact that air pollution is an externality is only true because I don't like breathing the stuff, or because I don't want to die earlier because of something in my preference function. So how about the fact that I have a preference function for your not having premarital sex, or a preference function for your not using drugs? Why shouldn't I be able to say, well, you're imposing a cost on me, and therefore, and he offered that. It was an interesting argument, which has problems, but it's not one that I'm inclined to accept.
I agree, but theoretically, you can imagine being able to predict things that are uncontroversial.
Right, that's right. The people are going to go crazy and kill other people. That's right. I suppose if you had a sufficiently extreme case, I guess that you would have an argument. It's like drugs. Suppose there were a drug which really had the effect that's claimed for various drugs falsely. The real effect was that as soon as you took the drug, you went crazy and took out an axe and started killing people. Well, it seemed to be appropriate to say, either you can't take the drug at all, or you can only take it if you first put yourself in a locked room with no axes in it, and where some competent person has got the key and will let you out after you're off the drug. That doesn't seem to be an unreasonable view. So again, it goes back to causation questions. So I guess if you really knew that having a certain kind of baby, that baby would inevitably grow up to be a mass murderer, that would be an argument for preventing it. But I don't think it's very likely.
Wouldn't you just need a negative expectation, though, if you're thinking about it?
I understand. You would have an economic argument for a negative expected value, but I find it hard to imagine good institutions that would do it, especially because if you really have technology that good, we'll have technology that will let that same set of parents choose to have a different child. Let me give you, entirely off the present topic because it's interesting. Robert Heinlein, in one of his first and least good novels as a story, has a very ingenious idea for what I like to describe as libertarian eugenics. And the idea is not controlling what children people can have, but letting parents control among the children they could have which ones they do have. So the basic idea is that once you know enough about genetics, you pick the sperm that doesn't have my hereditary bad heart, and the egg that doesn't have my wife's poor circulation, and the one that does have her musical ability and doesn't have my lack of musical ability, and doesn't, and so forth, and you combine them. And you can do a little bit of that now. The way you do it now is you produce a fertilized egg in vitro. You take it to the 8-cell stage. At the 8-cell stage, apparently you can remove one cell without damaging the pre-embryo, or whatever they call it. You take out one cell and you analyze it. If it turns out to be carrying a very serious negative genetic effect, you throw out that embryo and start again. If it doesn't, you don't. So that they're doing already. And of course, as you know, in classical antiquity, they had a version of this. They just waited until after the baby was born. But Heinlein's version is a much more elegant solution because you get a whole lot greater range if you can separately control egg and sperm than if you can only get the fertilized egg. Now, you might say it's impossible because you can't inspect the sperm without damaging it. But Heinlein had a very elegant solution to that problem. And that is that the mechanism that generates a sperm or an egg starts with a full set of chromosomes, splits it in half, and produces half of the genes in one body and half in the other. Well, if you're doing the whole process in vitro, which we'll surely know how to do in not that long, the split occurs. You destructively analyze the one you're not going to use. You destructively analyze a cell. We've got lots of spare cells. Subtract, and you know what's left in the one you haven't looked at. Use that one or don't use it 100%. I don't know if Heinlein thought the idea of himself. That's further evidence he was a genius. I think he's writing evidence of that as well. He may have borrowed it from somebody else, but it's a really lovely way in which you can use the technology to eugenically improve the human race without restricting anybody's freedom at all.
I think that's a good general point in that you can often have an externality argument. You say, well, we need the state to come in for this. But then you can imagine a technological solution, perhaps not that far in the future, that allows it to occur in a voluntary manner, which would be overall much more beneficial.
And the further problem is, again, that we don't have a good way of making the state do good things.
Yeah.
That after all, part of the sort of stuff that gave eugenics a bad name in the U.S. was the involuntary sterilization. And as far as I can tell, in the famous case, the one which gave rise to the line, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, it turns out it wasn't true. It turns out that there was not evidence that the particular woman who was sterilized was herself an imbecile or would have had an imbecile child. So I mean it's a further problem. But yeah, in principle, I could imagine circumstances in which what we would normally think is an action should be free to take had clear negative externalities on other people. Therefore, we stop.
We have time for one.
Yes.
What are your policy recommendations regarding global warming and how to make sure that
My recommendation is that one ought to do research, and it might at some time in the future turn out that one ought to do something about it, but at the moment one ought to do nothing at all about it. That we don't have good reason to believe that reducing it will make us better rather than worse off. We will have better information as time goes on. It is conceivable that we'll have good enough information at some time in the future to reverse that judgment, but not.
I think there's no way how to make sure that the net effect is positive.
We don't have a way of making sure that effect is positive. In two senses. We don't have a way of knowing it's positive. We don't have a way of determining the effect. We don't have good mechanisms for controlling the world. It'd be nice if we did. Depending as long as I got to do the controlling instead of you're getting to do the controlling. Or him getting to do the controlling.
We ever have the predictive power to make such a call, though? And this is actually sort of tapping both into this problem as well as, for instance, the problem of predicting how someone will turn out in terms of genetics. Because I sort of come from a biology background, and I think while we can, screen for genetic predispositions for physical defects, it's really hard to tell how someone is going to turn out in terms of their behavior. And that's because we're so multiple as organisms. So is probability enough in that case, or is the lack of...
Depends how high the probability is, it seems to me, in a realistic sense. That, we convict people and put them in jail on something less than 100% probability. We have to, because you don't get 100% probability.
Well,
yep.
As an anarchist, how do you propose that in your alternative reality, who would produce this knowledge about what the sign is, when this knowledge probably is a public good?
Yeah, I guess the answer is that there are imperfect private mechanisms of producing public goods. That I would like to believe that I have spent the last hour and a quarter producing a public good. I would like to believe that having more people enlightened about the subject I'm talking about decreases the chances that bad things will be done and increases the chances that good things will be done. If so, I have no way of propertizing that. But fortunately, I get sufficient side benefits from the pleasure of talking to people and persuading them of things, so I'm willing to do it anyway. And similarly, if you look at scientific research, some of it could be done for direct profit-making purposes, in the sense that if you are going to invest in things, knowing what's going to happen to the climate in the next 10 or 20 years could in fact be quite valuable. 100 years not so valuable. So you're going to get some of it done from that standpoint. You're going to get some of it done the way the academic world works in general, which is that you produce interesting stuff and that gets you a reputation, that gets you a job teaching undergraduates at Oxford. So I like to say that open source software is this wonderful invention and all that, but it's the way the academic world has been running for 100 or 200 years. That when you publish an article, you don't charge other people in your field for the information. Maybe you charge them for the paper, or maybe you don't. You probably give it to them if you can. And it's an open source system, and that if you publish your conclusions and refuse to give people the data you base the conclusions on, nobody believes you. And that's the equivalent of giving the source code for software, for those familiar with how open source software works. So yeah, you have various imperfect methods of doing it. There's interesting, I don't remember his name, Keeley, he's a British author, who's argued basically that in practice, basic research gets done without government funding. And part of his story, judging by, I haven't read his book, but I've heard a talk by him, I've spoken with him, and I'm going to be there tomorrow, actually, part of his argument is that it is valuable to firms to know what's happening in basic research because it gives opportunities for products and such. That people in basic research mostly talk to other people in basic research. And if they talk to other people, they probably wouldn't understand it anyway. And that therefore it pays some firms to fund a certain amount of basic research done by its employees in order that it will have an end into the world where that information is circulating, which then becomes commercially valuable. Just as, of course, part of what makes open source software work is that it pays a firm to hire a programmer who is also one of the developer of some important open source software they use, because if he asks somebody else in that community to do him a favor, they'll do it, because he's an insider in that particular one. So that's one of there are a bunch of ways in which public goods get produced, and I think economic theory correctly tells us that we can't count on the market producing any public good that's worth producing. But a public good that's worth 100 times what it costs to produce, odds are pretty high someone will find some way of making at least 1% of the benefit, and that will be enough to produce it.
Can I ask one more question
Sure.
regarding probability? I know you subscribe to polycentric law, and actually so do I.
Yeah.
Do you personally have a preference, let's say, for outlawing driving under the influence? Which I don't, because I think it's only harming someone if I've actually, as long as your action doesn't cause the damage.
This is the distinction which I discussed in Law's Order as ex ante versus ex post enforcement. Do you prevent bad things by saying if the bad thing happens, we will punish you for it or charge you damages? Or do you prevent bad things by saying you aren't allowed to do the thing which causes the bad, which might cause the bad thing? And as a matter of economic theory, there are advantages to both, and you can imagine cases where one or the other works better. In particular, if the bad thing you're doing, for example, has a certain probability of killing 100 million people, we don't have a penalty to impose if that probability arises large enough to make you take those costs seriously, and therefore we don't let you do it at all, assuming that we knew enough to be able to stop you from doing it. On the other hand, one advantage of the ex post method is that it mines your private information about probabilities, which we, the external people, don't have, by making it in your interest to take account of the risks you impose. So I guess in terms of the economics of it, any time that you can be adequately deterred by a damage payment, that's a better way of doing it. But if you can't be, maybe even can't be adequately determined by the threat you'll be hanged if you do it, if it turns out badly, then there's some argument for preventing the ex ante behavior. But I should also say that I don't think one can do the kind of clean, rigorous natural rights argument the natural rights people would like to believe in. I mean, I have a chapter in Machinery of Freedom, which is basically on that issue, and that there are just too many cases. First, we don't have a real derivation for natural rights, which is one of the reasons I prefer consequentialist arguments instead. Sort of my general view of how you persuade people of things, not sure it's right, but it's the policy I've followed, is to say, look, people don't disagree that much about what they want. That almost everybody wants a world where people are well-fed, happy, educated, a bunch of stuff like that. They differ in detail, but not in... If I'm right about my economics, socialism is a failure for everybody, not just for me. It not only doesn't give you a free world, it also gives you a world that's poor and sick and ignorant. Well, nobody wants that, or almost nobody wants that. So therefore, if I can persuade people of my consequentialist beliefs, I don't have to persuade them of my particular normative preferences. Since I don't have a good way of persuading anybody of normative preferences anyway, that's a good thing. Because, like everybody else, I have certain beliefs about right and wrong, but I don't think I have a good way of proving other people that those beliefs are right. And I think when you start thinking them through, even the beliefs I hold are not as clean and tidy as they seem to be. Anybody else? Let me say, in ending, I am not a utilitarian. I want to say this because various people seem to assert that I am. I actually have a comment in one of the poems in Machinery of Freedom on this subject. I think that the fact that some change makes people on the whole happier is a good thing. It's an argument for that change, but it isn't always a conclusive argument. I could imagine cases where I thought some particular policy made people a little better off, but was wrong in some a priori natural rights kind of sense. But I also don't think the natural rights argument is adequate by itself. So, And I'm a skeptic about moral philosophy anyway.
Thank you.